While I was at work, my parents moved my kids' belongings to the basement, making space for their favorite grandson to have the best rooms. When I came home and found my kids in tears, I decided it was time for payback. My parents had no idea what was about to happen next. But before we continue, if you love stories like this, hit that subscribe button so you'll always be the first to know when a new one drops. There was a time, not so long ago, when I truly believed our family was unbreakable. We lived together, 3 generations under one roof, sharing laughter and responsibilities, our home echoing with the sounds of daily life, kids running up and down the stairs, my parents exchanging playful banter over breakfast, and me, juggling work and motherhood, feeling lucky to have the support system I thought would always have my back. I remember the scent of my mother's Sunday roast wafting through the halls, and my father's deep voice reading bedtime stories to my children, their faces glowing with comfort and trust. It was chaotic at times, yes, but it felt safe, anchored by the unspoken promise that we were a team, looking out for one another through thick and thin. My parents often reminisced about their childhoods, telling my kids tales of resilience and family honor, stories I hoped would shape them into strong, kind adults. For years, I worked long hours, grateful my children had loving grandparents to fill the gaps. I thought we were building something sacred together, weaving the kind of memories that would bind us for life. But even the strongest foundations can hide tiny cracks, hairline fractures that only reveal themselves when pressure mounts. In our case, the pressure arrived in the form of my nephew, my brother's only son, a child who had always been treated as something special. How her books and drawings had been packed away without a second thought, I felt a rage ignite inside me that was unlike anything I had ever known. I went upstairs to confront my parents, my hands shaking, but they greeted me with the air of people who believed they had done nothing wrong, who saw their actions as logical and justified. My mother insisted that it was only temporary, though I had managed to ignore it for the sake of family unity. My parents doted on him openly during visits, but I never suspected they would let their bias destroy the balance of our lives. The first hints were subtle, a new toy just for him, praise that felt louder and more effusive when he was around, extra helpings at dinner served with a secret smile. I told myself not to read too much into it. After all, every grandchild has their moment in the spotlight, right? But as the days passed and my brother announced that his son would be staying with us for an extended period, the air in our house seemed to shift, like a storm brewing on the horizon. My kids began to sense it too, growing quieter. Watching their cousin receive attention they used to enjoy without question. It wasn't just about toys or desserts. It was about belonging, about knowing you have a place in your own home. I tried to brush aside the growing unease, telling myself it was temporary, that my parents would see reason and treat all their grandchildren with the same affection and respect. But I was wrong. The harmony I cherished was unraveling, thread by thread, replaced by a strange tension I couldn't quite put my finger on. I started to dread coming home, bracing myself for whatever new slight or discomfort my children might have endured that day. I couldn't understand how my own parents could allow such a rift to open in our family, and I struggled to find the words to address it without causing a confrontation I wasn't ready for. The truth is, I didn't want to believe what was happening. I clung to hope, ignoring the warning signs and focusing on my work, thinking that if I just gave it time, things would return to normal. Little did I know, the worst was yet to come. The day that would change everything was approaching, and I was completely unprepared for how deep the cracks in our family would go, or how much pain my children would have to endure before I found the courage to fight back. It happened on an ordinary Saturday, the kind of day that should have faded into memory without a second thought, but instead became the catalyst for everything that followed. My brother's car pulled into the driveway, trunk packed to the brim, and my nephew stepped out with a grin that was both excited and smug, as if he already knew he would be the star of the show. My parents rushed out to greet them, their faces lighting up with a joy I hadn't seen in years, the kind of unrestrained adoration that makes you feel like an outsider in your own life. My brother played it casual, announcing that his son would be spending the next few weeks with us while he and his wife handled some urgent business overseas. There was no discussion, just a fait accompli, another decision made without my input, but with the expectation that I would adapt, because that's what I always did. I watched as my nephew strutted through the front door, already scanning the house like he owned the place, and my heart clenched with a mix of anxiety and resentment that I tried desperately to suppress. My parents fussed over him, asking what he wanted for lunch, promising to set up his favorite games, and even offering to redecorate one of the bedrooms to suit his tastes. My kids hovered nearby, uncertain and suddenly invisible. Their attempts to join in met with polite indifference or, worse, gentle rebuffs that stung more than outright rejection. I wanted to intervene, to draw clear lines and remind everyone that this was our home, not a stage for someone else's spotlight. But I told myself it was just the excitement of his arrival, that things would settle down soon. The first night set the tone. My parents prepared a lavish welcome dinner, complete with my nephew's favorite dishes, some of which my children didn't even recognize because they'd never been made for them. The conversation revolved around his achievements, his grades, his soccer trophies, his funny stories from school, while my children's voices faded into the background. Every laugh, every word of praise felt like another brick being stacked between us, walling my kids off from the love and attention they deserved. I watched them push food around their plates, eyes darting to me for reassurance I struggled to provide. When I tucked them in later that night, my youngest asked me why Grandma and Grandpa loved their cousin more. I lied, as gently as I could, insisting it wasn't true that sometimes adults get carried away and forget to be fair, but the words tasted bitter in my mouth. Over the next few days, the imbalance only grew. My nephew was given privileges my children had never been offered: control of the TV, first pick of snacks, even input on family outings. My parents bent over backward to fulfill his every whim, dismissing any complaints from my kids as jealousy or just a phase. They said it with smiles, as if that made it hurt less. The air in our home, once filled with comfort and routine, now crackled with competition and disappointment. My children began to withdraw, their laughter replaced by silence, their playtime truncated by their cousins' preferences. I tried to compensate, sneaking in extra hugs and words of encouragement, but it felt like patching a dam that was already beginning to burst. The arrival of the golden grandchild had turned our family upside down, and though I tried to maintain hope that my parents would come to their senses, the look in their eyes, pride mixed with a possessive kind of love, told me everything I needed to know. The storm was here, and we were standing in its path, powerless to stop what was coming next. As the days slipped by, the change in my parents' behavior became more and more difficult to ignore, the subtle signs of favoritism coalescing into a pattern that felt as cold and undeniable as winter frost creeping along the edges of a window pane. It started with small things, little decisions that in isolation seemed harmless, but together formed a mosaic of partiality. My nephew was given the biggest slice of cake at dessert. His complaints about chores were met with indulgent laughter, and any mess he left behind was either overlooked or quietly cleaned up by my mother before anyone could say a word. My children, on the other hand, were held to standards that seemed to shift daily. One minute they were scolded for leaving their shoes by the door, the next they were told not to make a fuss when their cousin barreled through the hallway, scattering toys in his wake. I would watch my father settle into his armchair each evening, my nephew curled up at his side, the two of them engrossed in long conversations about science or sports or whatever new obsession the golden grandchild had picked up that week. My kids would hover nearby, eager to join in, only to be brushed off with a half-hearted maybe later, or worse, not acknowledged at all. Even their artwork, once proudly displayed on the fridge, was now replaced by my nephew's crayon masterpieces, my mother gushing over his talent, while my children's drawings found their way to the recycling bin. The unfairness gnawed at me, but I tried to keep the peace, hoping that by not making waves, my parents would see for themselves the hurt they were causing. Instead, the gap widened. Weekend outings became showcases for my nephew's preferences, with visits to his favorite park or movie theater, while my kids' suggestions were politely vetoed. I remember one afternoon when my eldest suggested a trip to the library, something she had always loved, only to be told that it would be boring for her cousin, and maybe they could all go to the amusement arcade instead. My daughter's face fell, her excitement dimming, but she nodded and tried to hide her disappointment, determined not to draw attention to herself. I tried to carve out special moments for my children, little pockets of joy amidst the imbalance, but it always felt like I was patching holes in a sinking ship. At dinner, my parents would ask my nephew about his day, about his friends back home, about what he wanted to do next. their questions never quite reaching my children, whose answers were greeted with distracted nods or gentle corrections. My youngest started having trouble sleeping, coming to my room at night and whispering that she missed how things used to be, when she felt like she mattered as much as anyone else. I listened, my heart breaking, not sure how to fix something that was being chipped away from within. The favoritism became a silent third presence at every meal, every conversation, every decision. My parents seemed oblivious to the growing rift, or maybe they just didn't care to see it, blinded by their affection for the grandchild they deemed more special, more worthy. I started to feel like a stranger in my own home, tiptoeing around my parents' moods and my nephew's demands, all the while watching my children shrink into themselves, their light dimmed by the shadow of someone else's spotlight. I knew something had to change, but I still hoped that love alone would be enough to restore the balance. The signs were there, clear as day, but I kept hoping that my parents would wake up before it was too late. I didn't know then how much further things would go, or how deep the wounds would become before the breaking point finally arrived. I remember that day with an intensity that still makes my pulse quicken, the memory etched in my mind like a scar that refuses to fade. It was a Thursday, and I had left early for work, trusting that my children would be cared for in the loving home I thought we all shared. I kissed them goodbye, reassured them that I would be back in time for dinner, and stepped into the morning with the kind of naive optimism that only makes betrayal cut deeper. The hours at the office blurred together, but I remember feeling uneasy, a vague sense of dread that clung to me all afternoon, though I couldn't explain why. I finished my shift, picked up a few treats for the kids on the way home, and walked through the front door expecting the usual chaos. Laughter, television noise, maybe a squabble over snacks. Instead, the house was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that signals something has gone terribly wrong. I called out for my children, and when there was no answer, I searched every room, my heart pounding louder with each empty space. Then I found them, huddled together on the narrow mattress in the cold, dimly lit basement, their eyes red from crying. Their clothes and toys had been dumped in boxes, stacked against the concrete walls like unwanted clutter. My eldest tried to be brave, blinking back tears as she explained what had happened, how Grandma and Grandpa had spent the afternoon moving all their things out of their bedrooms, telling them that their cousin deserved the best rooms because he was special and needed more space. My children's protests were ignored, their hurt dismissed as childish jealousy, and they were instructed to be grateful they still had somewhere to sleep at all. As my daughter described how her little brother's favorite stuffed animal had been tossed aside, that my nephew was a guest and deserved to feel special, that my children needed to learn to share and not be so sensitive. My father shrugged off my anger, claiming I was overreacting, that the kids would get used to it, and that family meant making sacrifices for each other. Every word felt like a slap, every rationalization more insulting than the last. I looked around at the evidence of their choices, the freshly made beds in my children's former rooms, the new posters on the walls, the toys and clothes neatly arranged for their precious grandson, and something inside me snapped. I realized in that moment that there was no misunderstanding to clear up, no apology coming, no way to reason with people who saw my children as less important, less deserving, simply because they didn't fit the narrative of who should be cherished. I comforted my kids as best I could, promising them that this would not be the end of their story, that I would not let anyone treat them as if they didn't belong in their own home. I tucked them in that night on their makeshift beds, holding them close and whispering that I loved them more than anything, even as I fought to hide my own tears. I stayed awake long after they fell asleep, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with plans, fury, and a resolve that hardened with every passing minute. What my parents had done was more than favoritism. It was a betrayal, a violation of trust so deep that nothing could erase the pain. I knew then that I couldn't let it stand, that I had to do something bold, something they would never see coming. That night, as the house slept, I started to plot the revenge that would shake the very foundations of our family, because I owed it to my children to show them that they mattered, that justice could still be found even in the place where it had been lost. There are moments as a parent when your heart shatters in silence, when the pain your children feel becomes a physical ache that no words can soothe, And that night in the basement was one of those moments for me. I sat with my children on that lumpy mattress, their little bodies pressed close to mine, and listened to their shaky voices try to make sense of the day's cruelty. My eldest tried to put on a brave face, whispering that maybe they could make the basement fun and turn it into a secret fort, but the effort was hollow and her eyes betrayed her despair. My youngest clung to her favorite pillow, one of the few things that hadn't been carelessly shoved into a box. Her face buried in my shoulder as she sobbed quietly, the kind of cry that comes from deep confusion, from a hurt that is too big to understand. I tried to comfort them with stories, reminders of their strength, telling them how proud I was of their resilience and promising that I would always protect them. But the words rang empty in that cold, unfinished space. Above us, I could hear the muffled laughter of my nephew and my parents, the cheerful noise of people who either didn't know or didn't care about the pain they had caused. It was as if we were ghosts in our own home, banished to the shadows while someone else claimed the warmth and comfort we had once called ours. My children asked over and over what they had done wrong, why their grandparents didn't love them as much, why they had to give up their rooms and all the little pieces of their lives that had made them feel safe. I wanted to give them answers, to assure them it was all just a misunderstanding, but the truth was there was no justification that could soften what had been done. The injustice was sharp and clear, and it filled me with a cold determination that burned beneath the surface of my grief. As the night wore on, I felt my anger transforming into resolve. I began to realize that this was not just a moment of disappointment or temporary unfairness. This was a turning point, a line that had been crossed from which there was no easy return. I promised my children again and again that I would fix this, that I would never let anyone make them feel small or unworthy, and that they deserved better, even if it meant walking away from everything we had ever known. They eventually drifted into uneasy sleep, their small hands gripping mine as if afraid I might disappear, and I stayed awake, staring at the ceiling, counting the hours until morning and mapping out every possible way to reclaim their dignity and their place in the world. In those dark, quiet hours, I saw with absolute clarity that my parents had failed them, failed us all, and that the only way forward was to show them just how much they had underestimated the strength of a mother's love. I knew what I had to do, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt a glimmer of hope, fueled by the promise that we would not be victims. Not now. Not ever again. That night, as I watched my children finally surrender to exhausted sleep, I made a silent vow in the darkness, a promise that echoed louder than any words I could ever say. I sat in the dim glow of a single bulb, listening to the steady, broken breaths of my children, and letting the injustice of the day wash over me until it solidified into an icy calm. I realized then that confronting my parents head-on would only lead to more gaslighting, more justifications, more empty reassurances that would solve nothing and heal no one. Instead, I needed to be strategic. I needed to protect my kids and teach my parents a lesson they would never forget. My mind began to race, sifting through every possible move I could make. Leave that night and never look back. Lash out in anger and demand they undo the damage, or quietly orchestrate something far more powerful. I chose the last. The next morning, I woke before dawn, careful not to disturb my children. I went upstairs and made coffee as if nothing had happened, my parents greeting me with forced cheerfulness, already preparing my nephew's favorite breakfast, asking me about my plans for the day. I smiled, polite and distant, playing the role of dutiful daughter, masking the storm beneath my calm exterior. I packed the kids' lunches, helped my mother with chores, even complimented the redecorated bedrooms as if I approved of their choices. The contrast between my outward composure and my internal fury made me sharper, more focused. I watched every interaction, every subtle glance exchanged between my parents and my nephew, cataloging the ways they continued to exclude my children, the way they justified their decisions with self-righteous certainty. My kids kept to themselves, avoiding the main rooms of the house, their laughter now a rare sound, their confidence eroded with every dismissive comment and every reminder that they were no longer welcome in spaces that used to be theirs. I made sure to spend time with them alone, assuring them that everything would be okay and that I had a plan, though I offered no details. I wanted them to trust me, to believe that the powerlessness they felt was temporary. Inside, my anger had transformed into something sharper, more disciplined. I began to quietly gather important documents, sentimental items, and the possessions my children cherished most, placing them in bags that I hid in the car's trunk. Every trip out of the house became an opportunity to quietly move our lives into a state of readiness, to prepare for an exit that my parents wouldn't see coming. I paid attention to my parents' routines, to the times of day when they would be most distracted or least likely to notice my preparations. Each evening, after my children had gone to sleep, I wrote lists of everything we needed and mapped out possible places we could go, safe spaces where we could regroup and heal. I refused to let my pain cloud my judgment. I would not let anger make me reckless. I rehearsed conversations in my head, prepared for every protest and guilt trip my parents might try, determined not to let them twist my resolve. I comforted my children with hugs, whispered affirmations, and quiet reassurances that they were not alone and that I would always put them first. The weight of their trust anchored me, kept me moving forward even when doubt crept in. I knew that my parents saw me as weak, as someone who would accept any treatment in the name of family harmony. They were wrong. I was silent, yes, but my resolve was ironclad. Every moment spent watching my children navigate the aftermath of their displacement fueled the fire inside me, making me more certain with each passing hour that the time for patience had ended. Soon, I would show my parents the true cost of betraying the ones I loved most, and when I did, there would be no going back. The final decision came to me with the clarity of a sunrise after a long, stormy night. I woke up before everyone else, heart pounding with anticipation, and tiptoed into the basement to wake my children. Their eyes fluttered open, groggy but full of hope as I whispered that today was the day things would change. I told them softly to gather their favorite clothes and most precious belongings. Nothing too heavy, nothing they couldn't carry themselves. The urgency in my voice must have given me away because they didn't argue or ask questions. They trusted me completely, and that trust made my resolve even stronger. I led them upstairs one by one, helping them fill their backpacks, sneaking trips to the car to stow away the bags we'd packed in secret over the past days. The house was still and silent, sunlight filtering through the curtains as if nothing out of the ordinary was happening. But I moved with purpose, fueled by the quiet adrenaline that only comes with the knowledge that everything is about to change. When my parents finally stirred, I greeted them with a calm, almost cheerful energy, serving breakfast and asking about their plans for the day. My nephew bounded in, bragging about the adventures he was planning with my father, oblivious to the undercurrent swirling beneath the surface. I watched my parents smile at him, heard them praise his every word, and felt the sting of their obliviousness like a physical blow. My children ate their breakfast quietly, eyes lowered, their bags hidden by the back door. I smiled, played along, and waited for the right moment. As soon as my parents became preoccupied, my mother busy in the garden, my father fixing something in the garage, I motioned to my children. We moved quickly and quietly, slipping out of the house with practiced ease, each of us carrying the weight of what we were leaving behind, but also the hope of something better ahead. I packed the car, buckled my kids into their seats, and for a brief moment, let the tension fall away. My hands shook as I started the engine, but my voice was steady as I told my children that we were going somewhere safe, somewhere we could be ourselves again. I didn't let myself look back at the house. I didn't let myself cry. Not yet. Instead, I drove away, heart pounding with a mixture of terror and relief, knowing that this was the beginning of our new chapter. For the first time in weeks, my children looked out the window with curiosity instead of fear, asking where we would go, what we would do next. I promised them that no matter what, we would be together, and that together was all we needed to start over. We drove for hours, stopping only when we were far enough away that my parents' reach could no longer touch us. I found a small, cozy hotel for the night, checked us in under my own name, and let my children choose the beds they wanted, the TV shows they watched, the snacks they ate. The freedom was exhilarating, almost surreal. I watched them settle in, reclaiming their laughter, their sense of safety, their sense of self. That night, as I tucked them in under unfamiliar covers, I told them how proud I was of their bravery, how much I loved them, and how this was the start of our real adventure. I knew that my parents would be furious, confused, and hurt by our sudden disappearance, but I also knew that their anger was nothing compared to the healing my children and I needed. Packing our bags was more than an act of escape. It was an act of self-respect, a declaration that we would never again be pushed aside or made to feel small in our own story. As the first rays of morning light spilled through the unfamiliar curtains of our small hotel room, I knew it was time to put my plan into motion and truly turn the tables on my parents. I had anticipated their reaction. They would call, text, and leave frantic voicemails demanding explanations, each one laced with a mixture of outrage and disbelief. I let the phone ring, ignoring every attempt to reach us, knowing that any conversation would only devolve into more justifications and guilt trips. Instead, I composed a single, carefully worded message. I told my parents exactly why we had left, spelling out the pain and humiliation they had caused, and making it clear that until they could acknowledge the harm they'd done and commit to treating all their grandchildren with love and respect, we would not be returning. I sent the message, then blocked their numbers for the time being, refusing to let them invade our newfound peace. I wanted my children to witness a mother who stood firm, who refused to let injustice and favoritism define the limits of her love. That day, I called my boss and explained the situation, grateful to discover understanding and support rather than criticism. I arranged to work remotely for a while, using the opportunity to look for a new place to live, somewhere my children could feel safe and cherished, where their rooms would never be taken from them again. I started reaching out to friends, quietly letting them know what had happened, and was met with a wave of compassion and offers of help. It felt strange and empowering, building a safety net beyond the family I had always relied on, discovering that real support comes from those who recognize your worth and stand by you in moments of crisis. Meanwhile, my parents' confusion and anger intensified. My brother tried to mediate, leaving messages imploring me to reconsider, insisting that my parents meant well, that it was all a misunderstanding, but the damage was done. I refused to engage in circular arguments or accept apologies that glossed over the truth. I stood my ground, focusing on my children's healing, slowly helping them rebuild their confidence and sense of belonging. I took them on walks, played their favorite games, listened to their stories, and watched as the light returned to their eyes. With every day that passed, the pain of what we'd endured faded a little, replaced by a growing sense of freedom and self-respect. I kept careful documentation of everything that had happened, every message, every incident, just in case my parents tried to escalate things or twist the narrative to make themselves look like the victims. I was prepared for every possibility, but my priority remained my children's well-being. It wasn't long before my parents began to realize that their grip on our lives was slipping. Their attempts at control had backfired spectacularly, leaving them isolated and forced to confront the consequences of their choices. I heard from mutual relatives that my parents had begun to argue, blaming each other for what had happened, growing desperate as their favorite grandson grew bored and restless in the rooms he'd been given at such a high cost. The house that had once been filled with laughter was now echoing with regret and emptiness. I felt a surge of vindication, not out of cruelty, but out of the knowledge that justice was being served in a way my parents could never have predicted. For the first time, they had to face life without the comfort of my children's love and presence, and without the illusion of harmony they'd destroyed in pursuit of favoritism. Turning the tables wasn't just about leaving, it was about reclaiming our dignity, rewriting the script, and proving that real family is built on respect and unconditional love, not on sacrifices made at the expense of the innocent. In the days that followed our departure, the full weight of my parents' decisions began to settle in around them like an unwelcome shadow. The house, once so lively and warm with the sound of all their grandchildren, became eerily quiet. My nephew, deprived of an audience and the novelty of being the favored one, grew bored and irritable, often acting out in ways my parents were wholly unprepared to handle. The best rooms no longer felt like a prize but a glaring reminder of what had been lost in pursuit of favoritism. My brother, hearing both sides, started to question my parents' choices more openly, challenging them in a way he never had before. Without the buffer of my children's gentle presence, my parents' flaws and favoritism were laid bare for all to see, fracturing the image they had tried so hard to maintain. Relatives who had always assumed we were one big happy family began to call, asking uncomfortable questions and pressing for explanations. My mother's voice, once full of certainty, now trembled on the phone as she struggled to explain why her daughter and grandchildren had left so abruptly. My father, proud and stubborn, found himself alone more often than not, as even my nephew began to seek out other places to spend his time, places where he wasn't the center of attention by default. My children, meanwhile, blossomed in the safety of our new life. I found a small apartment not far from my work, with 2 cozy bedrooms that my kids could decorate however they liked. The first night we slept there, I watched my children twirl with excitement, choosing their own sheets, hanging their artwork on the walls, and rediscovering the joy of having a space that was truly their own. Their laughter returned, bright and genuine, and with every small milestone, a new friend at school, a quiet evening spent reading together, an afternoon baking cookies in our tiny kitchen, I felt the satisfaction of knowing I had made the right choice. The healing was slow, but it was real, and it radiated through every part of our days. Eventually, word got around about what had happened, and friends and extended family began to rally around us, offering support, empathy, and validation. My parents, left to stew in their self-made loneliness, tried to reach out with apologies that grew increasingly desperate, but I made it clear that forgiveness would only come with true understanding and lasting change. They had to sit with the discomfort of their own actions, to feel the sting of exclusion and longing, to see what happens when the people you take for granted finally decide they deserve better. My brother, too, distanced himself for a while, protective of his own son, but unable to ignore the truth of what had happened. In their own way, everyone involved had to reckon with the reality that love and respect are not entitlements. They must be earned, nurtured, and never weaponized. It was a painful lesson for my parents, one that forced them to confront parts of themselves they would have preferred to ignore. But for my children and me, it was poetic justice, a chance to reclaim our worth, to build something stronger and more honest from the ruins of what had been. Watching my children thrive, knowing they would never again be asked to sacrifice themselves for someone else's comfort, was all the vindication I needed. As weeks turned to months, the sharpest pain dulled into memory, and our new life began to feel less like an escape and more like a homecoming, a return not to a place but to ourselves, to the values and love that had always been at the heart of our family, even if others had forgotten. My children grew more confident, their smiles steady and unguarded, their voices no longer hesitant when they spoke up for themselves or shared their dreams. I watched them blossom with a bittersweet pride, knowing they had been forced to learn a lesson most children should never have to face, but also knowing that their resilience was now woven into the fabric of who they were becoming. The distance from my parents gave me space to reflect, to consider the boundaries I needed to maintain not out of spite, but out of self-respect, and the fierce duty I had to my children. I understood now that loyalty to family does not mean tolerating harm or pretending that everything is fine when it isn't. It means holding each other accountable, demanding honesty, and protecting those who cannot protect themselves. Over time, my parents continued their efforts to reach out, their messages shifting from denial and excuses to genuine apologies tinged with regret and a dawning recognition of just how deeply they had wounded us. I allowed slow, cautious conversations, making it clear that reconciliation would require more than words. It would require a change of heart, an honest reckoning, and a willingness to put love into action, not just sentiment. I saw, little by little, a softening in their attitudes, a humility that had never been there before. And while trust could not be rebuilt overnight, I left the door open for the possibility that they might one day earn back a place in our lives, on our terms. My brother and I, too, found a new understanding. A quiet agreement that family bonds are sacred but not unbreakable, that our children deserve better than cycles of favoritism and hurt. Our story became a private legend among friends and relatives, a cautionary tale, yes, but also a testament to the strength it takes to stand up for what's right, even when it means walking away from what you once held most dear. Most of all, I wanted my children to remember this time not as a period of exile, but as the season when their mother chose them above all else, when love meant protection and justice, when family loyalty meant fighting for each other's happiness. In the end, we found peace not in the absence of conflict, but in the presence of boundaries, forgiveness, and the hard-won certainty that we would never again let anyone, no matter how close, decide our worth. As I tucked my children in each night, in a home that was finally ours, I whispered promises I knew I would always keep. That they were enough, that they were loved, and that together we could face anything. That was the lesson, the real inheritance I wanted to leave them. A lesson in family loyalty that would last a lifetime.